Hello girls, this is Miss Young, Head of the Art Department. Myself and my team would like to introduce you this week to our Thought of the Week, which is focused on Women in Art Month. We are celebrating female artists. Now we've got several learning objectives for you. Firstly, to understand the difficulties women have faced in art as a career over the years, how things have changed today. Secondly, to introduce you to lots of interesting facts about different women in art. Thirdly, to understand the importance of having female artists as well as men. And fourthly, to promote equality for women in art, because equality is incredibly important. So in our first slide, we're going to be talking about access to art education and the difficulties that women would have faced in the 19th century. So today you go to school, you can study art, photography, textiles, there are a lot of different opportunities for you. But back in the early 1800s, it wasn't quite the same. Women weren't actually allowed to study subjects like art. But things started to change. Around about 1837, a famous college called the Royal College of Art in London actually opened its courses to women. But not in the same way. They actually had a separate school for women. They called it the female school. And they studied in a slightly different way to the men. So on the right of this slide, you see a picture of what we call a life drawing. A life drawing is where students learn to basically study the anatomy of the human form and learn to draw the human body in accurate proportion. And it was important that they had actual life models, real people standing in front of them nude, and then practicing drawing those so they got it right. Now the women weren't actually allowed to do this. The men carried on life drawing as per usual, but the women, they had to draw a man dressed in a full suit of armour because they thought it was inappropriate for a woman to draw a nude male. Now fortunately things changed and equality happened, and then gradually in 1861 they allowed women to draw a man but draped in material fabric instead. And then by the 1870s things changed altogether in Western Europe and North America, and then obviously they could draw a full nude model. But there were lots of rebellion against that, and the Society of Female Artists was established in 1855 in London, and they gave women an opportunity to show off their artwork as well, because women were not as well celebrated as men. Beatrix Potter was another very famous artist. You'll see her picture of her work of Peter Rabbit on the left-hand side, and she faced difficulties in her education, but she came through nonetheless. So on this slide, I'm going to introduce you to a group of artists called the Gorilla Girls, representing all the female artists out there. They're basically a group of women who wear gorilla masks, and they don't want their identity to be known. So they're a little bit like Banksy, the graffiti artist, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. And they wear these gorilla masks in public. They go around, they create posters and wreak havoc basically, and try and promote female artists and try and get rid of sexism, because sexism is a big thing in art. It's surprising how women aren't really represented in the art world as much as men are. And just to give you a few facts, in 2016 we had 63% of students studying art and design at university who were female, but only 29% of women were actually represented by art galleries. So that's a really small percentage. In 2014, only 7% of artwork on display in the Museum of Modern Art in America, in New York, was by female artists. 7% in the whole gallery. It's just crazy. So we want to try and promote female art, and so do the Gorilla Girls. Have a look at their artwork. There's an example here on the bottom left of this slide where they've stated, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Commenting on the fact that a lot of the pieces of art that you see in an art gallery would be nude models of women and just women posing in different way, but actually the art, not many of the pieces are by women themselves, just because men seem to be celebrated a lot more than women do. So I'd like to introduce you to Anna Atkins because she was actually one of the first female photographers. She was born in 1799 in Kent, so a very long time ago. And you'll see some images of her work on this slide and a picture of her. She was well known for capturing plant shells and algae in these special pioneering technique called photograms, which was actually invented by a man called William Henry Fox Talbot. Now, Anna's dad was a scientist, and he had the belief that sons and daughters should be treated equally. So he encouraged her with her interest in botany. Botany is the study of plants. And because he met William Henry Fox Talbot and found out about this pioneering photogram technique, he passed that on to his daughter. And his daughter decided that she was going to start creating her own photograms of different types of plants. Some of the ones you can see on this slide, these are actually something called a cyanotype, which is where two chemicals are painted onto a piece of paper with a paintbrush, and then the object is placed on the paper and the paper is put out in the sunlight. And what happens is the sunlight exposes the paper and changes the colour of it around the outside of the object, creating this sort of silhouette of the object itself. And then the paper's washed off to get rid of all the chemicals. That technique was created by somebody else called John Herschel. But she used both of these techniques and created her own photography book where she assembled 307 different images of these plants. She wasn't well known at the time, but years later, in the 1970s, her photography was rediscovered by some art historians. And they pulled it all out and had a look at it and realised actually she was the first female photographer. So she's now celebrated years later. So on this slide, I'd like to introduce you to the Turner Prize, which is a really famous art competition. It's a British art competition. You have to be British, born in Britain or working primarily in Britain to be able to be eligible to enter. And the prize is basically awarded to an artist for their most recent work, not one piece, but a body of work. And the artist can win £25,000, which is a huge amount of money. And it's a very prestigious award as well, and it helps their careers massively. It was introduced in 1984 by a group of people called the Patrons of New Art, and it was dedicated to helping the Tate Gallery and also to promote contemporary art, which is modern art today. It was named after the famous artist J.M.W. Turner, who was a landscape painter. But unfortunately, women didn't seem to win the award. It wasn't until 1993 till they actually awarded the first female artist with the Turner Prize. Her name was Rachel Whiteread. And if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of the screen, that's an example of one of her pieces of artwork. So she was well known for casting different spaces. So she was a sculptor. She created these sculptures. And she would have used plaster or rubber or even resin to basically make a sculpture of a space or beneath a space or on top of a space. So in this example, you see the inside of a house which is cast. So you can tell it's a house, it just looks a little bit peculiar, as if it's sort of inside out. But it was brilliant that Rachel actually won that prize. This was followed then in 1997 by another artist called Gillian Wong, who was the next winner. And in that year, there were several women. In fact, it was an all-woman shortlist for the prize. So I'll show you some work on her on the next slide. On the left of the slide, you can see some work by the artist Gillian Wong, who was the Turner Prize winner in 1997. The example here is a photograph, but actually Gillian Wong was also well known for her video installations, and the work that helped win her the Turner Prize that year was something called 60 Minutes, where it featured 26 policemen and women, which she asked to basically stand still for an hour for a video portrait. So you can imagine what happened gradually as the minutes ticked by. The policemen and women who had to stand there completely still gradually started pulling very uncomfortable faces and fidgeting quite a bit as they struggled with standing in one spot for a full hour. So it was a bit of a kind of humorous piece by Gillian Wong. On the right, there's also one of the other nominees, Christine Borland, whose work was based around scientific and forensic police work. So she did lots of kind of reconstructions of various forensic scenes. So on this slide you can see the two other nominees from 1997. One of them was Cornelia Parker, who was well known for her hanging installations. This one on the left that you can see was her garden sheds, which she asked the British Army to blow up, and then she reassembled it as a hanging installation, which has been projected onto the walls of the gallery and has created this kind of shadowed effect. On the right hand side you can see Angela Bullock's work, and her work was based around systems, patterns and rules. Again, the one on the right, the picture that you can see is a series of bean bags. So it asked the participants to walk into the gallery, and as they walked in, some sounds were set off and some lights were set off as well, so there were lots of things going on around them. And on the wall there was this digital piece that started to sort of take shape in front of them. So it was a kind of something that affected their senses in different ways. So we couldn't do a Women in Art presentation without showing you Frida Kahlo's work. And you can see her featured here with a photograph on the left hand side on the front of a magazine. She was a very famous artist and considered to be one of Mexico's greatest artists. Very famous for her monobrow and her very bright clothing and fantastic jewellery. She experienced some horrible things in her life. She was involved in a horrific bus accident when she was younger, and a car collided with the bus and she was impaled onto a steel handrail which went through her hip and out the other side. So she was left with some horrible fractures to her spine and her pelvis, which gave her problems throughout her life. On the right hand side you can see a picture that she painted, and it features her in the background on a hospital trolley, and she's actually holding like a back brace as well. So many of her pieces of artwork were very symbolic and told stories about different parts of her life. She was also married to a very famous artist, Diego Rivera, who was a mural artist, and he was actually the more well-known out of the two, but then gradually Frida Kahlo became more famous, and she exhibited her work in Mexico and Paris. In fact, she was so ill one day that when she was due to have an exhibition, she was unable to stand, so she actually had the bed, her four-poster bed, taken to the art gallery, and she was able to be at her exhibition but sort of presented it from her bed, which was really interesting. So I thought I'd end this presentation by showing you some of the most expensive pieces of artwork in the world by female artists. Starting with the piece on the left hand side, this is by Georgia O'Keeffe. It's a painting of a white flower, and it was produced in 1932 but actually sold for £27.8 million in 2014 at Sotheby's auction, which is a huge amount of money. On the right hand side we have the most expensive sculpture by a female artist, and that was by someone called Louise Bourgeois. It was a spider and it was made of metal, and it actually ended up selling for £24.5 million. And then finally, I've included this because it's a complete contrast, and I'm sure some of you are going to be looking at this thinking, well, miss, it's a bunch of paint just thrown at a canvas. Well, yes, it's part of the artwork movement called abstract expressionism, and that's what artists did back then. So it's kind of a representation of her feelings and her thoughts. And that sold for £12 million at Christie's auction, so a phenomenal amount of money, which just proves that female artists can be incredibly successful too. I hope you've enjoyed our thought of the week for Women in Art. I just wanted to conclude by telling you a little bit more about the further events that we've got running. We've got competitions, we've got videos, information, various projects that we're putting up online. So if you go on the school website and look under the students section, between now and the 6th of December, there'll be lots of things added on there. Then you can also check your school emails for information on the competitions. We've had an art one, a photography one, and a fashion design one so far. We've got a graphic design one coming up this week, and there'll probably be one last one in the first week of December. Go on our school Instagram account as well, which is chsfg_art_comps, where you'll see all the wonderful pieces of artwork entered by our students so far. Thank you for listening.